Hello, everybody. We're live. I'm really excited. Happy to be here. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late, but I'm really excited to be sharing some thoughts with you on shame. This is actually one of my favorite topics to discuss when I'm working with people, and it's the thing that comes up probably the most as I do work with people, whether it's addiction or not, or trauma or not. This shame is at the core of so much of what we struggle with as people. So I love talking about it because there's a way to work through it and heal it. And for my own experience personally, again, I've had some shifts and I want to share some of those as well. So I'm excited to be able to jump on with you. I hope I can see questions as they come in. I should be able to. So what I want to do is I want to first just kind of outline what our focus is over the next few weeks. So number one, I want to spend the time today to discuss shame just as a foundation. Make sure we're all on the same page, defining it. How do we know where it comes from? It's important to know where it comes from, what triggers us, what are our shame triggers, so we can know what to do with it when it does get triggered. How do we recognize it? How do we identify those triggers? How do we know when we're in shame? And then that all sets the stage for the process of healing. And so I was just working with the first session just an hour ago, and again, shame's at the core of it. Just a young woman who's struggling with just kind of difficulties that she's going through, and again, that all links back to shame. Clients that I see in couple relationships, shame is such an issue, especially in addiction and trauma cases, because shame drives this negative interaction between both people. So today I wanted to focus on the foundation of what it is, all of those things, setting the stage. Week 2, I want to talk specifically about strategies to heal it, and how do we manage the pain that we're in? How do we start to get unstuck? Because again, shame is something that's one of the most common things that we struggle with, and I want to devote that specific week all about strategies and what we can do about it. Week 3, I want to talk about how to address shame within the relationship. Again, one of my favorite things to do is help people connect when shame hits, help spouses know what to do when their other spouse goes into shame, strategies to be able to help them help themselves, and help the relationship to still stay connected and grow, even in the midst of feeling like you're getting pulled apart by shame. So there's lots of things that I want to address in the relationship context. And then week 4, that's open right now. And so as we go along, as people have questions or if there's other specific things that we want to cover, then we'll spend the time on that in week 4. So that's the outline. Again, I'm excited. So what I was thinking about, I wanted to start today and share my own experience with shame and how I didn't know that it was shame until I was in grad school, or maybe after grad school. So my own experience when I was younger, take a step back. I'm religious. I'm LDS, and so at home, especially, we're taught the things that we should be doing, right? The commandments. Trying to stay on track, be kind to people, do these positive things, be good people. So that was a message that was taught in my home. And I remember being a teenager, and I felt like a sense of depression. And I was like, am I depressed? I wasn't sure, but I felt like this kind of fog or this cloud, and I kind of just felt down, or I just felt bad, even though I was doing really well in terms of the majority of everything that I was being taught. I was on the right track, but still there was a disconnect and I felt bad. And I remember somehow I came across a book on depression and I got it, and I remember I hid it in my trunk. I think I was 16, so I was driving at the time. I hid it in my trunk. I didn't want anybody to know about it, which is of course a flag for shame, but I didn't know that. But I just was like, I couldn't, I didn't want to talk to my parents. It would feel weird, or I didn't want them to think of me differently, again, which is all shame stuff. But in the moment I just felt bad. I just felt kind of guilty. And even if it was small things that I did wrong, which of course we all do, guilt was the word that I thought that I was experiencing. And so as I went throughout school, I went to grad school, got my marriage and family therapy degree, and learned more and more about Brene Brown. That was my first introduction. No, let me actually take a step back. My first introduction to shame was a classmate of mine who at the time, he was struggling with his own addiction to pornography. And he had been doing work for a couple years. And so he was kind of like my mentor, teaching me about this. Because I remember when I was in school, I had the thought, I should probably learn how to treat this. I'm sure I'll see it a lot, in the church or just generally. So I started asking him a ton of questions. And I remember there's one specific presentation where they had a panel of 4 women who had gone through traumatic experiences when they were younger. And they were just sharing about their experience and wanting to educate people, educate us as students. And I was sitting next to him, and when they would be telling their stories, he'd be like, "That's shame. That's shame." And then she'd go on to say something, and he's like, "Yep, that's shame too." I'm like, what are you talking about? What is shame? How are you seeing it in what they're saying? And so as I've devoted the last, I don't know, a handful of years studying the topic, trying to understand it, working with people, I can do the same thing now with people. I have this like lens or this filter I can look through to like quickly identify that's shame, or that behavior that's coming from a place of shame. That thought, same place. Whereas when I was in school, I couldn't. And so as I learned more and more about it when I was in school, I came to the understanding that what I had been experiencing for a long time, it was shame. And what I was just explaining to a person an hour ago was the difference between guilt and shame. So Brene Brown has an excellent definition about that. I guess to paraphrase it, it's the feeling or belief that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and connection. Guilt, how I explained it to this young lady, guilt and shame are so different. Guilt is focused on behavior. It's, I did something wrong. I made a mistake. I did something bad. Shame is focused on self. I am bad. I'm broken. I'm flawed. I'm unworthy. There's something wrong with me. Again, guilt is there's something wrong with what I've done. And what I told her was, she was religious as well, and she talked about wanting to be, following the commandments and be on the right track. So I said, guilt, when we feel guilt, we say, I'm sorry. We make amends. We repent if we need to. And in her situation, she again wanted to kind of adhere to more of the rules of what she'd been learning. So I said, we repent if necessary, and then guilt goes away. But I said, when we experience shame, we can repent, we can do good things, but we're just still riddled with the feeling of, why do I still feel so bad? And that is what I had been experiencing for so long. Like, I had been working as hard as I could to be on the right track, but still I felt bad. And after I learned that it was shame, like, everything shifted for me. Like, this whole other world opened up in terms of how I can address it in myself so I didn't feel so bad. And a part of what was so huge was just the sheer understanding of what it was, that it actually wasn't me, that it was just this outside thing. Because so often we experience shame and we think it's us. And it's almost like I think about a radio, right? We tune into this channel of shame, of these negative thoughts, and then we start to believe them, and we think it's us. We really do genuinely believe there's something wrong with us, at least on a subconscious level. We feel it, and we get stuck there. And so my mind was opened up when I learned about shame and how it wasn't me. There was nothing wrong with me. Sure, I might have been making mistakes along the way, like everybody else, but just like I said, the sheer understanding of me identifying what shame was and how it affected me, that like immediately, actually I don't want to say immediately, gradually, like there's this shift, and I felt differently. And I was able to separate myself from shame. And so whenever it showed up, not only was it less intense, but it showed up less often because I had a name for it. I could describe what it was, and I knew what it felt like. So when it came back, it's like, oh, that's shame again. And so this is an especially important topic for me personally because of how much it changed my life and all of the work that I do with clients. Like it's centered around this topic because addiction it stems from shame. Betrayal trauma, often the roots of it are shame. And when we learn how to heal it after we identify it, like again, this whole, like everything starts to change and things feel way better than they ever did when we were stuck in shame. So that's kind of my background in terms of how this progressed for me and like why I love talking about this so much, because there's an out. We don't have to feel stuck forever, which is exciting for me because I'm in the business of change, and I want people to heal and grow, and I want people to get what they need as fast as possible. Like I'll tell this to like every client who comes in, I don't want you to have to be in here for the next 5-10 years. Like nobody wants to be in therapy forever. But if we have the right tool for the right job, and we can heal shame and we can heal addiction and trauma, and understand these tools and strategies, the process doesn't have to be 5-10 years. Once you understand what the actual issue is and you heal it at the core, you can get the results that you need much, much faster. So this is, like I said, especially an important topic for me. So one of the things that I think is so important for people to understand is there's a disconnect between the head and the heart, as I kind of like to describe it. So the head is, no, I know I'm a good person. I know I'm a good mom, or I'm a good dad. I'm trying hard. I make mistakes, but everybody does, but I'm on the right track. I think about the heart, or more the emotional side of it. That's the place where we get stuck. Up here, it's like, I know I'm a good person, but down here, it's like, no, you're not. And you don't believe that. Or, no, I'm trying, or I am worthy of connection. Down here, it's like, nope, no, you're not. It's not at all. There's something wrong with you. There's this block. And so it's so frustrating for clients to feel like, no, I know I'm okay. I know I'm doing my best, but not being able to feel it or believe it. That's where the stuck place is. And so understanding that stuck place, I guess just describing this in another way, that stuck place is shame. And shame, I think, can be a belief and it can be a feeling. The feeling physically, right? Our chest gets tight. Sometimes our palms get sweaty. Or another thing, I remember reading one of Brene Brown's books. She talks about the feeling that we get when a truck hijacks on the highway and is coming right at you is the same feeling of shame. The reason is because if a truck is coming at us, our body goes into fight or flight, and then physically we respond, right? Adrenaline pumps through our veins, our muscles get tight and get ready for action. The same thing happens in shame because both of them are danger cues to our brain. Sue Johnson, who I love, Sue Johnson is the founder of Emotionally Focused Therapy, and super effective because it gets to the root of why we're struggling as people and why we have a hard time connecting with other people is because these emotional blocks get in the way. And she said that she cited some research in one of her books and said that if you step on a nail or if you're isolated in a social situation, the same place in the brain lights up because they're both danger cues. It's the same thing. Social rejection and isolation, which is, again, this fear when we experience shame. We feel like we're unworthy of that connection. We don't survive as a species unless we learn how to connect and bond with other people, right? You think about how things are set up. Nobody lives on these islands by themselves. We live in communities. We live in families. We have friends. We have groups. We have these ways to support each other and connect. And that's by design because we can't survive when we're young without somebody taking care of us. And so the need for attachment, the need for connection with somebody else, we actually never outgrow that. And sometimes the need for somebody else is pathologized, or in other words, we see it, me not personally, but there's a school of thought that we see that as a problem if we need somebody else, if we need reassurance, or if we need comfort. There's a school of thought, or there's people, even in the recovery community, who think, no, I shouldn't need anybody. I should be self-sufficient. I shouldn't have to rely on my husband or my wife for anything. Emotionally, I should take care of myself, and that's just not true. And when we experience pain or sadness or anger and feel like we have to keep it to ourselves and not share it, or if those feelings if it's weak to share them and we have them, that's a part of where shame can get reinforced, is if we think, well, I shouldn't have these feelings, and if I do, and they're not going away, what's wrong with me? And then that whole loop begins as well. And so all of this is to say, again, as people, we must have connection with others. And when we don't, that social isolation, that shame, sparks that same place in the brain as physical pain. And we have to figure out how to manage it. And so going back to this disconnect between the head and the heart, when we start to heal shame, I remember, Tony Robbins, I don't know if anybody's heard of him. I love Tony Robbins. He has some excellent stuff out there. And he said that a belief is nothing more than a feeling of certainty. And I think about it in this context. If I believe down here, not up here, it's a subconscious thing. Our beliefs operate in the background. And we can't talk ourselves out of beliefs. That's why there are certain exercises we have to do when we heal shame. Talk therapy is not the most effective thing that I found because, again, up here I already know I'm a good person, but it's like I can't believe it. So if a belief is a feeling of certainty, and I'm certain that I feel bad, I'm certain on a subconscious level that I'm bad, that I'm unworthy, that feeling is the thing that we need to break. And so going back to this idea of connecting the two pieces, there's ways to bridge the gap to where it's like, I feel like I know I'm a good person here, and I start to feel it because my belief changes about myself. And then I start to reinforce it enough to where my new default is I am enough. I feel certainty that I'm enough. And then I line those two pieces up, and I just feel like that release process, that I feel, what's a good way to describe that? Like it's congruent. And so a part of, again, what we're going to talk about today is identifying what those beliefs are for you. Because if you don't know what they are, they operate in the background whether you know about them or not. So we need to make them very clear. We need to make them concrete so we can start to challenge those things. Because then it depends what belief it is, that what approach we use, and we want to get the result. So again, this disconnect between the head and the heart, that's a big part of what we're going to be addressing when we start to heal shame. So in the very beginning, I think about the process. My question, or the topic is, where does it come from? So there's a guy named Troy Love who's a lifestyle therapist, I think out in Texas. And he did a lecture, or he actually wrote a book. I got a copy of it. What is it called? It's called Finding Peace. In his book, he talks about the beginnings of shame. And I thought it was fascinating. And I send this audio, this like lecture that he does, to pretty much everybody that I work with, because it's important that we're all on the same page in terms of language, in terms of the beginnings of it. And he kind of goes through this whole thing. And I want to highlight a couple of things that he said. And I can even post it on this. I'll even post it after we finish this, just so anybody else wants to listen to it. It's like an hour long. So I'll take a couple of the pieces that he talks about. He says, number one, shame. When we're told if we can't have certain feelings, or if we're scolded for being sad, or if we're told, don't cry, don't be angry, boys don't cry. I think especially men, we get this message more and more than women do. But if feelings are not okay in our house as we're growing up, we have to figure out how to manage them. And usually what we do is we either numb them with food, or alcohol, or drugs, or pornography, or any number of Facebook. It doesn't really matter what it is. We find some strategy to numb it, or we disconnect from it. And the pain that we feel, it's still there, and it operates in the background. And then this belief starts to show up. And these negative beliefs stem from a handful of experiences that he describes as wounds. So he says there's 6 types of wounds. So I want to go through them briefly to see if any of these resonate for you guys as you listen. So the first one that he says is rejection. When we experience rejection, especially when we're young, and shame pretty much always develops when we are young, when we experience rejection from friends or from parents or siblings, as a young child, we don't know how to process that without the help of somebody else. Emotionally, we don't have the capacity to self-regulate when we're young. Our brain just doesn't know how to do that. And I think that's pretty evident with parents who have young kids. They can cry and cry and cry, but like we're starting out. I have a 2-year-old, so she's our first one. And when she cries, if we were just to let her alone and not address it, and I again, like this, I guess this idea of attachment and shame helps me because I can respond. I know how to respond a little bit differently than if I didn't. But I know that when I go to her and I comfort her and I name her feelings, I give her the language. Again, Sue Johnson cites some research that says once we even put a name to our feelings, they calm down. So if I can go to her, I can hold her and I say, hey, are you scared right now? It looks like you're scared. Or, hey, honey, it looks like you're sad. Are you okay? And if I say, you look sad, we've done that enough. She can recognize I'm sad, or I'm frustrated, or I'm angry. And so when we're young and we experience rejection and no one's there to comfort us, we have to figure out how to deal with that on our own. And nobody's there to say, hey, I'm just mad. Like, let's say mom and dad are arguing. Kids don't know how to separate. Mom and dad are upset at each other. They just think mom and dad are mad. I'm like, wonder if they're mad at me. And again, even if it's pre-verbal, kids take on like the tension and the distance or just the feeling in the house. They just kind of take that on. One of the words I remember being in school, they describe it as egocentric, which is to say everything is all about them. Not in a bad way, but just like they can't separate themselves from other people. So if they feel rejected, or if there's like tension or whatever, they take that on themselves, and they don't get that emotional comfort or support from their parent because they're hijacked by their own difficulties or struggles. They start to interpret that as, I wonder if mom and dad are mad at me. I don't feel like I'm important. I don't feel like my needs are getting met. Again, it's like they're not like talking themselves through that, but that's the effect of it. And they start to develop these negative beliefs about themselves as a result. So rejection is one of the ones that he covers. Then the second one is neglect. So that's pretty evident, right? Especially with parents. If the kids aren't getting their needs met, they can't meet their own needs for safety and comfort and food and all these other things, warmth, closeness. So if they feel neglected, the effect of that, people start to develop shame around that. Like, what's wrong with me? Mom and dad aren't comforting me. Or I'm mad all the time. There's something wrong. They just start to feel bad, which forms this belief about themselves. Rejection, neglect, abandonment. Again, a kind of a similar thread. The next one is betrayal. When we're younger, we can experience that. A lot of times betrayal is a little bit older, but betrayal in relationships with friends or parents or spouses. When we feel betrayed by somebody else, and that happens consistently, or if it's a very extreme one, and if there's already the beginnings of shame there, it reinforces, like, well, I wonder if there's something wrong with me. And it's not up here. It's like, no, my husband or my wife made that choice, and I know that's not about me. But down here, it's like, yeah, maybe it is, though. Maybe it is because I'm not enough. He did this or she did this. So the sense of betrayal can reinforce that as well. The next one is abuse. Abuse is, in my opinion, the thing that creates shame the most, because it's a violation of what is appropriate. It's a violation of boundaries, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, verbal. Like, abuse has the capacity to damage somebody like nothing else. We as people are so fragile, and like our feelings are so like tender, if that's a good word to describe it. Like, we can be damaged by somebody else, and abuse is one of the fastest ways to have our self-worth damaged. And so if we're abused when we're young, like, I've never met somebody who has been abused in the past who hasn't experienced shame. Maybe those people are out there, but that's one of the fastest ways for that feeling to get locked into our nervous system. And we start to believe ourselves as unworthy or broken or dirty or any variation of that word. And so abuse has such a detrimental effect on us as people. The last one is loss. And this one, not everybody has. Of course, everybody loses something, but they don't necessarily internalize that as shame, but it's a wound that we experience. And so I think it's important for us to figure out what wounds did we experience present day or when we're younger, to be able to figure out how then to move forward in healing it. Because if we experience a certain kind of wound, whether it's rejection or neglect or abandonment, the process of healing that might be a little differently if it's like abuse or if it's loss. Not necessarily, but it depends on the person. But I think it's so crucial to understand where it came from for you specifically. What wound do you resonate with the most? And then specifically, as a result of that wound, what do you believe about yourself on an unconscious or on a feeling level? So the next part of what he talks about, which I want to highlight, is how do we know if we're in shame? And he talks about it as, or he describes it as these voices. He says we hear these voices in our head, not in like a schizophrenic way, but we hear these voices, and when these voices are activated, that means something, one of our shame trigger, like one of our wounds gets triggered, and we experience shame. And so he goes through and he lists 5 different voices, and I want to go through these with you as well, just quickly. So number 1, the judge. The judge is probably the most common. He or she shows up and is super hard on you. This is like the critical voice. It beats you up for not being good enough, that beats you up for not being perfect enough, for not doing the right thing or failing. The judge has a very backwards way of doing it. And so a quick little aside, all of these voices are geared towards trying to repair or compensate for shame. So the judge shows up and tries to beat you up and to get you to be better by berating you, which of course is backwards and it doesn't work at all. But the judge tries to motivate you in that way. But of course, it makes it worse because when we're hard on ourselves, our brain perceives us as the enemy. And again, we're stress, like cortisol, these stress hormones are released. And the harder we are on ourselves, the more our body responds, puts ourselves into fight or flight, and then we perform less. Then when we perform less, and if our judge is super loud, it's going to tell us we didn't perform and we're lazy and something's wrong with us. And then just like that cycle goes on forever. So the judge is the first voice. The second voice, he says, is the victim. And the victim says, there's nothing that you can do about this. It's this woe is me stance. My husband or my wife did this and I just, I can't control him and I'm never this is a hopeless place and I'll never overcome this. And we go within ourselves. And of course, there are moments that we're going to feel pain. We're going to be impacted by our spouse. But this victim has a different quality to it, right? We turn within ourselves. We see this oftentimes. I know as I've seen different comments on the group, husbands are very quick to go to the victim stance. There's something wrong with me. And as we go inside of ourselves, there's more distance between us and our spouse, which is the opposite of what we need in those moments. We need comfort and reassurance, but we go to the victim stance, we go inside of ourselves, and then they feel even more like neglected or alone. So the victim, we go inside ourselves and we just have to figure out how to deal with it, but we stay stuck. The next one is the doormat. So he describes this one as you just let other people walk all over you. You say yes when you mean no. It's very difficult to hold boundaries because the fear is that if I hold a boundary, if I'm not a doormat, if I stand up for myself, that somebody else is going to be offended and or they're not going to like me anymore. And because we're wired for connection, we tend to sacrifice ourselves for the possibility of connection with somebody else. So we say yes to all sorts of things, or we, again, going back to the idea of boundaries, we let people cross our boundaries in hopes that they'll give us the attention, the affection, the comfort that we need. And when we let somebody cross our boundaries, of course, we feel worse afterwards. We're saying yes when we mean no, and then we feel stuck and we cycle in that same place as well. We get angry with ourselves, we beat ourselves up, and then just that continues to perpetuate. The next one is the rebel. The rebel, this is one of the most connected ones with addiction. It's this like screw everybody mentality. I don't care. It's not a big deal. Oh, you don't like it if I watch this or if I don't do my recovery. Like I don't care. It doesn't matter. And that like there's this pushback. And the rebel again is compensating for this part of them that feels broken or unworthy. They go to the complete other side and tell themselves and tell other people that they don't care what others think of them. They don't care if they're hurting anybody else. But the reality is they do, but that's just how it manifests. And like I said earlier, the goal of these voices is to compensate and try to get us out of feeling so bad, but it doesn't work. But it's so helpful to know what our voices are. What do we hear most? What stance or strategy do we use? Because that can be also another indicator of when we're in shame. And as soon as we know that we're in shame, like sometimes it's easier to recognize this negative self-talk. So as soon as we notice it, it's like, oh, I'm being hard on myself. We can kind of trace that back. Okay, well, what do I feel then? Well, I feel kind of sad, or I feel alone, or I feel neglected. And then does that connect with some shame belief about ourselves? So this is just another way to be able to identify by checking in with these voices. How has our shame been activated? And then it gives us a way out of, well, what do we do about it now? The last thing that I wanted to cover today is, let's see. One thing that stuck out in one of Brene Brown's book that I read, I thought it was just me. It was the book. She talks about another place that shame exists is in our unwanted identities. This I thought was very interesting, and it helped explain an experience that I had last year. So I'll kind of go through it quickly. So I was at an event. I was at a Tony Robbins event. I'd never been to an event. I heard some of his stuff on YouTube, and I went there, and it was amazing because he's all about healing those, or like overcoming, breaking through those limiting beliefs, which I guess in our language is shame. So the conference was from Wednesday to Sunday. And I grew up in a household where we didn't do anything on Sunday. So this was ingrained in me. It's like, we don't do this on Sunday. We don't play sports. We don't do anything with my friends. We go to church and we focus on spiritual things, which is good. somehow that was so cemented inside of me, though, that if I ever do anything on Sunday, like, shame shows up right away. And I think, again, when I was growing up, I think it was guilt, but it's not. The shame that I realized, so a quick little backstory is when I went to this event, I went through, Wednesday through Saturday. The next day, I'm like, should I go or should I not go? And I decided I would go to church. I went to 9 o'clock church, and then after church ended, or after sacrament, I went outside, and I still couldn't decide. I'm like, should I go? And as you're listening, it might seem like so petty, but because that's like my shame area, I got stuck there. I'm like, should I go? Should I not? I literally like debated that for an hour in my car. And then I thought, okay, you know what? I'll go and I'll see how I feel. I went. As I parked, I walked to the venue. I saw a guy digging through a dumpster. And of course, when you see that, your heart gets moved. And I had some like granola bars in my bag. So I pulled out like all the granola bars that I had. Here, you can have all these. And then I walked away. And, he's grateful for that. I walked away and I felt good. Like, this is where I need to be. And then I went into the venue, and they were on a break. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll go back outside in my car, continue to think about if I'm going to stay here or not. As I was walking back to my car, I saw somebody else who was homeless, and went to my car. I had some bread and peanut butter, and I brought the loaf of bread and the peanut butter, and I was going to give it to him. And he's like, sorry, I'm allergic to peanuts. And I had like 1 or 2 other granola bars that I gave to him. And then I went to the front of the venue. I saw another homeless person, and I gave her my bread and my peanut butter, and she said, thank you, like, God bless you. And my thought was like, this is what Sunday is all about. It's about serving people. It's about loving. And I say that because that's an important thread in the story, because I ended up going to the event. I was there for like an hour, and then I just, again, like, the shame was gnawing at me, which is so stupid, but it was gnawing at me. I was like, all right, fine, I'm going to go home. I'll just listen to this on the audio version if I can find it. And I left, and I didn't put this together at the time, but like, I set the story up by, like, I did good things. Not to brag, but this is important because it didn't matter how many good things I did, I still felt shame. I still felt like, what is wrong? Like, I did what the Sabbath was created for. I was trying to serve other people, but because, and again, this is what I put together later, there was an unwanted identity around not doing something on Sunday. Like this, almost like this image, like I have to maintain this image of like, this is what I do. This is what a good church member does. Again, that's like the shame voice. Because I bumped up against that voice, it didn't matter what I did leading up to it. That voice unraveled all the good things, and I just felt frustrated, and I was hard on myself. But I processed through this. I had my little audio thing that I was talking through, and on my way home. And as I put all this together, it allowed me to then start to challenge it, because then the unwanted identity, or the shame message that I got was, good church members, like something along the lines of like, good church members don't do things on Sunday. And so because I was able to distill my experience to that phrase, I could challenge it. And I thought, like, no, that's not true. Sometimes people have to work on Sunday. And a part of why I went to the conference was for work, because I want to figure out how to get people the results that they need. And so I felt like, he might have some tools for me, and he did. So the thought was, good church members, good, if I'm a disciple, I don't do anything on Sunday. But then I thought, like, no, there's a leader in our church who was a pilot. And I think, like, he was working on Sunday, I'm sure. Like, that's something that's required for pilots, sometimes with the schedule, or police officers or firemen. And I thought, like, that's not true. Like, that shame message that I got is actually not true. And I had an example that I could compare it against. And as I started journaling all this stuff, and I challenged that message and understood where it came from, I was able to break that link, and I started to feel better. Like, there was just this release. And that's the thing that happens when we break shame, is we start to feel a sense of relief. We start to put things together in a different way. And now that shame trigger isn't as strong anymore. It doesn't come up as intensely. Like, if there's more room for me to explore, is this something that's good? Is this something that I want to do? Versus, I better not do this or I'm a bad person. So I think it's so common for us to get stuck with shame, and it's painful. And I want to spend all of next week talking about, what do you do about it? But the first thing that we need to do is figure out, what is our shame triggers? I had an assignment. I'm going to write these on the board, or on the post. But if you guys can focus, there's one last little piece I want to include. And never mind, I'll save it for next week. We've been going for a little bit here. So I want you to focus, if you would, this week. start to try to figure out, number one, what are the wounds that you experienced? What are those things that might have resonated with you? And I'll put that other link to the lecture on here so you can go through it a little bit more in depth. As a result of those wounds, what do you believe about yourself? Not necessarily on a conscious level, but on an unconscious level that works in the background. That's the thing that filters our experience, is our beliefs. So if we have some negative belief about ourselves, figuring out what is that belief about yourself as a result of those wounds. Next, what do you tell yourself when you're in shame? What voice shows up for you? Is it the judge? Is it the doormat? Is it the victim? Like, what resonates with you? How do you know if you're actually in shame? Because the more you know you're in shame, the sooner you catch it, the faster you can challenge it, the faster you can separate yourself from it, which brings relief in and of itself, just knowing that we're not shame. That was something that was so huge for me. Like, even like to this day, if I go anywhere, if, like, let's say I go to church, or let's say I'm talking with somebody, I have, like, let's say a critical thought shows up. I can tell myself, like, that's just a thought. That's just the mind doing what it does. The mind thinks. The mind observes. The mind makes judgments. But if I can identify it as just a thought, that's not me, that, hey, I actually don't believe that thought, there's like a space in between having the thought and going into shame. And that space is awareness. So the more aware you are, the more you can just challenge that thought and recognize it is what it is, just a thought. It's neutral. It depends on how we act on it. It depends on, like, if it goes into our heart and we treat somebody in a certain way, like that's where it can cross the line for people. But if a thought shows up and we're able to just kind of let that thought go, that's totally different. And so the awareness of the shame in those moments is key, so we can start to challenge it. So if I can encourage all of you to do a handful of those things in terms of identifying your shame, we're going to spend, like I said, next week discussing those things. I want to do some exercises that I learned about last week and walk you through some of those things, but that will set the stage for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll go from there. So I look forward to, if there's any questions, please feel free to comment or message me, and we can address those in the next episode or discussion, and we can go from there. Okay, thanks a ton. We'll talk to you soon.